The chief promise does begin in Genesis 3:15. Reformed scholars have called this the beginning of the covenant of grace, where God promises to Eve that her son will crush the head of the serpent. And so it's that promise that really encapsulates God's salvation and sets out a paradigm that will be followed for the rest of human history. I think it's always helpful to think of this in terms of Eve's point of view. Eve wasn't happy with the serpent. He just tricked her. And you could see she would want vengeance. And so what does God say to Eve? That serpent that just tricked you and got you kicked out of the garden, though you sinned, I'm going to defeat him with one of your sons. And so it's the son, not Eve. Eve's not the one to destroy the serpent, not Adam, but one of their sons. And so the promise comes not to a daughter, but to a son. And so this isn't a sexist arrangement, but it's arrangement looking forward to Christ. The fact that Christ is the Redeemer, thus the promise is a son. And so for those saints, they have to express their faith in terms of the promise. God says it's going to be a son. So it's not that their daughters weren't important. Their daughters meant another mother who might bear the son. But a son meant maybe he's the one. And you see this in Genesis 4 when Eve has Cain. She names him, and it's clear from the text, she thinks he's going to be the one to kill the serpent. Well, we know what happens with Cain. So then they hope that Seth will, and so she names Seth in faith as well. I think as we look at God's promise in the Old Testament, that the promise is coming through a son, it adds a certain virtue to marriage and childbirth, one that actually changes with the new covenant to some extent. Now, marriage is a creational good. Having children is a creational good. And so these are key parts of our piety, parts of our children are members of the covenant. The promises are to them, but the particular way in which God uses our children has changed. So in the Old Testament, with Eve and with Abraham and Sarah and the patriarchs, when they had a son, they looked at that son as a possibility of being another Redeemer, or the father of of the Redeemer. And so they named that son in faith, knowing that either he will be the Redeemer or he will be in the line of the Redeemer. Well, now that Christ has come for us in the New Testament, the Redeemer's come. We're not having children hoping that they will be the Redeemer. Christ has come. And I think a very clear example of this is Paul. What does he advocate? Singleness. That was not advocated in the Old Testament. In fact, singleness or barrenness was considered a shame and a curse. In fact, the only place in the Old Testament where you have explicit singleness commanded is with Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 16. And there it's clearly part of the symbolic curse role that he has at the end of Israel's or Judah's nationhood right before Babylon destroys them. And so we have children because God created us as families and husbands and wives, and it's good and we rejoice, and our children are in the covenant, but we don't name them thinking they will save us. In the Old Testament, they named hoping that that would be the Redeemer.